It's pretty staggering to think about. Just 2 decades after the war to end all wars, the entire world was right back at it, plunged into a conflict bigger and deadlier than anyone had ever seen. So how on earth does that happen? How does a fragile peace just completely shatter and lead to the deadliest war in human history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to break down.
It really wasn't one single event, not one spark that just set the world on fire. It was more like a slow burn, a chain reaction of economic misery, unchecked political ambition, and diplomacy that just completely failed. So what we're going to do is trace that chain of events, piece by piece, and see exactly how the stage was set for a second global war.
All right, here's our roadmap. We're going to start with the incredibly shaky peace that was left over from World War I. Then we'll look at Hitler's rise in Germany and the international policy of, well, looking the other way, appeasement. We'll also jump over to Asia to see what was happening with Japan's expansion, and then finally watch how all those last dominoes fell. Let's dive in.
So our story doesn't actually start in 1939. We have to go back to 1919, right at the end of the First World War. The peace treaty signed was supposed to guarantee this never happened again, but for Germany it was a disaster. The new government, the Weimar Republic, was hit with crippling war debt and a toxic myth, the idea that Germany hadn't really lost the war but was stabbed in the back by its own leaders. That combination of economic pain and national shame created, well, the perfect breeding ground for extremism. And into that perfect storm of chaos and resentment stepped one man, Adolf Hitler. He and his Nazi party didn't just tap into the public's anger, they weaponized it. They offered up simple, hateful answers for some really complex problems. And he wasn't exactly hiding his playbook. In his book Mein Kampf, he spelled out his strategy with this chillingly honest quote. He knew that a big lie, blaming all of Germany's problems on Jewish people and other minorities, was an incredibly powerful tool to unite a broken country behind his terrifying agenda. And those words turned into action with terrifying speed. Just look at this timeline. In 1933, a fire at the Reichstag, Germany's parliament, became the excuse to just shred civil liberties. Only 2 years after that, the Nuremberg laws were passed, which legally stripped Jewish citizens of their humanity. And by 1938, that state-sponsored hate literally exploded onto the streets with Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. It was a horrifying signal to the world of what this regime was capable of.
So, as this massive storm is gathering over Germany, you have to be asking yourself, where was the rest of the world? Well, the truth is, haunted by the brutal memory of World War I, most nations just chose to watch from the sidelines. As Hitler started to illegally rebuild Germany's military, the world's response wasn't confrontation, it was accommodation. This policy got a name, appeasement. Leaders, most famously the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, made a huge gamble. They figured that if they just gave Hitler some of what he wanted, they could satisfy his hunger for power and, most importantly, avoid another devastating war. It was a bet that was based on a totally fatal miscalculation, the idea that Hitler's ambitions actually had a limit. And right here, you can see that gamble failing, step by agonizing step. In 1936, Hitler marches troops into the Rhineland, a direct violation of the post-war treaty. The Allies, they do nothing. In 1938, he annexes Austria. Again, no military response. Then, at the Munich conference, he's literally handed a chunk of Czechoslovakia in return for a flimsy promise of peace. With every single concession, Hitler learned a crucial lesson. The West was not going to stop him. He was being emboldened. But believe it or not, the crisis brewing in Europe was only half the story. A second, parallel storm was gathering on the other side of the world, in Asia. Imperial Japan, driven by its own ambitions and a desperate need for natural resources, was kicking off a massive campaign of expansion across the Pacific.
And this expansion wasn't random at all. It really kicked into high gear in 1931 with the invasion of Manchuria. But the really critical turning point came in 1936 when Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact, formally allying itself with Nazi Germany. This was the foundation of the Axis powers. By 1937, Japan launched a brutal, full-scale invasion of China. The two storms brewing in Europe and Asia, they were now officially connected.
Okay, so that brings us back to Europe, where Hitler, now more confident than ever after years of getting his way, set his sights on his next prize, Poland. He started making demands for territory, but this time, something was different. The policy of appeasement was finally starting to crack. The world was reaching its breaking point.
But just as the world was bracing for a showdown, Hitler pulled off his most cynical and shocking move yet. In a move that sent a shockwave across the globe,
the fanatical anti-communist leader of Nazi Germany, signed a non-aggression pact with his #1 ideological enemy, Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. It was a deal that absolutely nobody saw coming.
So publicly, this Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was just a simple promise not to attack each other. But the real story was hidden in a secret protocol. As you can see here, the two dictators had secretly agreed to become partners in crime. They literally drew lines on a map to carve up Poland and the rest of Eastern Europe between them. For Hitler, this pact removed the last major obstacle to his plans. It was the green light he had been waiting for.
And with the Soviet Union promising to stay out of it, Hitler wasted no time at all. On September 1st, 1939, German forces stormed into Poland. That was it. That was the final act. Britain and France declared war on Germany, and the Second World War in Europe had officially begun.
So, after all that, how do we make sense of it all? It is so important to understand that there was no single cause of World War II. It really was a perfect storm, a cascade of interconnected failures, aggressions, and miscalculations that led the entire world down an incredibly dark path. You can really think of it like a chain reaction. First, the deeply flawed peace after World War I created massive resentment. That was then set on fire by a global economic crisis. This instability then allowed aggressive imperialist regimes in both Germany and Japan to rise to power, promising to restore national glory through conquest. And when the rest of the world failed to stop that aggression, every small victory just made them hungrier for more, making a massive conflict pretty much inevitable.
And all of this history leaves us with a really critical question. When we see this pattern, economic instability fueling extremism, diplomacy failing in the face of aggression, it forces us to ask, what lessons from the 1930s are the most vital for us to remember in our world today? They say the past doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Thanks for watching.